Hi everyone, welcome back. A little bit of a hype moment before we begin, but the channel has finally become monetized! Way! I finally convinced Father YouTube to give me a pittance of their money. Next stop is obviously to somehow find a way to become a multi-millionaire by talking about progressive rock. That might take a while. Anyway, guys, gals, non-binary pals, welcome to Rhyme Signatures, my nerdy little spot on the internet where I flap my head up and down and opinions about music emerge. Today, I'm going to be taking on what I consider to be 10 of the best one-and-done albums across progressive rock and metal, and anything at least reasonably adjacent as such. Couple of rules. Nothing that came out in the last couple of years, guys. For God's sake, they're still warm. We can't push them into the oh well, at least they tried bracket just yet. Also, if there's rumblings or confirmations of follow-ups within the last 2 years or so that I'm aware of, then that discounts you from the list too. I'm looking for projects that are sadly more or less not coming back. Now, of course, this could all age like milk, and honestly I hope it does, because I'd love to see more from every single one of these bands. So without any further waffling, let's get right into things in alphabetical order. Starting things off, released 6 years ago and with a tiny listener base of just 251 monthly listeners on Spotify, let's take a little look at Negative Space by the band Artificial Silence. Very much feeling like the kind of natural evolution or extension of Between the Buried and Me's work from Coma Ecliptic, the band captures that kind of vibe perfectly, but manages to feel very much like their own thing too. To have an album of this quality would be an achievement for any band, let alone a band who yet to produce anything subsequently. Now, I'll be honest with you, this one didn't fall under my crosshairs until only a couple of years ago, but it hasn't taken very long at all to worm its way into my brain and become what I consider to be a long-term classic of the genre. Managing to piece together all the various exciting elements of experimentation and instrumental melange that we so often associate with the genre, there's also over a dozen guest musicians filling in the gaps with the likes of cello, flute, trumpet, and choral work amongst others. Negative Space is an album that's pretty maximalist from its opening moments right until the end, but always manages to be tasteful, as well as being executed with considerable panache, and I cannot recommend this one enough, as this is easily one of the best progressive metal albums of the 2010s. Now then, one of my personal biggest weaknesses, and one I don't see anywhere near enough of, is when you have dueling male and female vocals in progressive metal. One taking the high road, the other the low road, and both working in harmony to create some extraordinary textures and moods. The Old Man and the Spirit is the very textbook definition of what I mean by this. If people were ever to ask me to explain myself, I would direct them to the track of The Struggle and ask them to thank me later. Beyond the Bridges offering on this list remains one of my most listened to albums possibly of all time. It's the perfect blend of traditional instrumental technicalities with a frankly outstanding ear for engaging and hooky melodies to create a concept album that's both fascinating in its narrative flow, but also mesmerizing from a purely musicianship perspective. The 6-minute-long Triumph of Irreality is one of the greatest, nearly, instrumental songs in the history of the genre as far as I'm concerned. If its wild guitar tapping, breakneck pace, foot pressed down hard on the accelerator attitude doesn't stir some kind of emotional resonance within you, then I fear you may actually very well be dead to the genre's charms. The Old Man and the Spirit is littered with tasteful leitmotifs, beautiful structuring, and just the right amount of late 90s Disney schmaltz to feel sweet but not sickeningly so. This is one of my favourite prog metal albums ever. Please listen to this and mourn with me the loss of this incredible band to the world. Now, typically when you think of Arjen Lucassen, you would quite accurately be thinking of his grandiose, B-movie flavoured Aerion project, full of the camp sci-fi theatricality, plenty of cheeky playful moments, and a proclivity towards a certain brand of unique silliness. And honestly, this can be traced across most of his discography. Aerion, as already mentioned, his solo album of Lost in the New Real, The Gentle Storm, Supersonic Revolution, Star 1, Plan 9... They're all a little bit daft at their basest levels, but not so much with Guilt Machine. This briefly entertained project saw Arjen recruit Jasper Steverlink on lead vocals, and with his particularly morose delivery came a project that felt darker, more haunted and sinister than anything we've come to expect from him. I mean, sure, yes, the signature trappings are still here, of course, but they're a guide rather than a crutch, as we see far more experimental and intriguing sounds being played with here. To create a project that was not only unique within Arjen's catalogue, but also stood out as being arguably his finest work. I've always loved the dark, moody, synthy, gothic feel of Guilt Machine, and I will die a happy man if I ever get to remove this album from a list of one-and-done bands. Y'all know how picky I can be with purely instrumental albums, so for a nearly 70-minute long record without a single word being uttered to be on this best of list, you know it's playing with something a little bit tastier than the norm. Hadal Sherpa's 2017 self-titled album is my absolute favourite instrumental album of all time. Above anything by Camel, Liquid Tension Experiment, The Aristocrats, man, just forget everyone else, because frankly I feel Hadal Sherpa did it better. This Finnish five-piece manages to say more with their instruments than words would ever allow, crafting a kind of thick, tangible atmosphere that's as intoxicating as it is complex. Some of the tapestries played with here are absolutely stunning in the breadth of their variety and bold adventurism. You've got flutes, keyboards, sweeping atmospherics, and thick, meaty riffing, you know. The band will take you to all corners of the globe with their thematic influences, and it's almost dizzying with how varied this album actually is. But it's remarkably consistent, and while it definitely comes from a classic-era state of reverence, Hadal Sherpa still managed to maintain a solid unifying identity for their music across the album's considerable runtime. I feel like I could play 5 seconds of this album in isolation and still identify it as them without a moment of hesitation or doubt in my mind. I sincerely hope that the band has been hard at work for the last 7 years in making a follow-up to this, but if not, then at least they've secured their legacy in the world with this modern masterpiece of instrumental prog rock. I remember bumping into this band ages ago because somebody linked me to their absolutely, quite frankly, bloody brilliant cover of Dream Theater's A Fortune in Lies. But for as good as that cover was, and still is, it is the album they made that cemented them as true visionaries in the genre. Released at a time when the gent movement was not quite yet ruling the roost, and everyone and their mum was still suckling at the teat of the aforementioned Dream Theater, Kalisia's Scibion managed to be something strikingly different that I still don't think has ever been replicated. In the roughest possible terms, this feels like an Aerion album if Cynic wrote it. It's got that familiar sci-fi sheen, the heavy keyboards, the structuring and attitudes of one of Arjen's creations, but then we've got the brutal death metal vocals, you know, the crunching, riff-heavy guitars and atmospherics that feel thick with the trappings of late 1980s sci-fi movies. Split across 4 major movements, revelation, elevation, regression, and extinction, Scibion is a dramatic, bold, and exciting record that took risks with its sound and felt like a true example of progressive metal. Now, while we'll likely never see another album by Kalisia, Scibion was released 15 years ago, no signs or rumblings of the beast waking again. This remains an unmissable classic of the genre that you cannot afford to miss or pass on by. Check out the Dream Theater cover like I did, and I guarantee you that you will definitely want to sink your teeth into the full 71-minute long experience. Okay, anyone who's been following modern progressive metal within the last 15 years will surely be aware of this one. Everyone watching this video has likely been anticipating this one appearing, and I'm happy to not disappoint. I think more so than possibly anything else on this list, Quiet World is the strongest example of a truly remarkable thing being taken from us too soon. And I will forever be living in the naive hope that this will not be the last we will ever see of this band. Very much subscribing to the quirky, esoteric, creative and unusual brand of progressive metal seen in part from bands like Between the Buried and Me, Haken, Dream Theater, etc, etc. What Native Construct lacked in their originality of influence, they made up for in their originality of the execution of these elements. Yes, they did wear their branding on their sleeves a little bit, but the sum of the parts made for an album that felt distinctly them, that felt unique to their sound, despite the clarity of where it all came from. We move from smooth jazz to brutal death metal in the blink of an eye, with some of the most fluently constructed and engaging songwriting I've heard from any progressive metal band of recent years. and Quiet World is still an unmissable classic of the genre that deserves every inch of praise that is heaped upon it. Oh, hey look, it's the second instrumental band of the bunch. Who knew I had at least two of them ready for this list? For those who aren't aware of this little troupe, Nova Collective is what happens when modern progressive metal royalties start exchanging emails, and before you know it, a supergroup is born. Consisting of Dan Briggs from Between the Buried and Me, Matt Lynch of Cynic and Treescapes, and Richard Henshaw and Pete Jones of Haken, the DNA of all of these bands can be felt in full force on this magical little one-off project, feeling jazzy at its core with every instrumentalist fighting for the pedestal, but managing to do so in such a balletic fashion, never once stepping on each other's toes. The Further Side is a masterclass in intercontinental ballistic metal. These are some of my favourite musicians alive, Richard and Dan especially, and to hear all of these guys working together, bringing their own individual musical inspiration to bear and how it blends and flows to make something entirely new but also instantly familiar and warming to fans is nothing short of wonderful, and I sincerely hope that the guys consider trying out this fun little project again, because Nova Collective really does deserve more time to fully develop into itself to become one of the true elite supergroups of prog. Oh, and hey, speaking of supergroups, it's Octavision. No, not a Dream Theater cover band as I originally feared when the name was unveiled. This is instead a remarkably well-formed traditional progressive metal band, consisting of Hovak Alverdian on guitars, Jeff Scott Soto on vocals, Roman Lomtadze on drums, Merzo on keys, and the main draw for me, friggin' Billy Sheehan and Victor Sodding Wooten on bass? As a low-end warrior myself, to have two of the best living bassists on one project together, how could I resist? To me, this represents the sort of music that Whom Gods Destroy and Sons of Apollo should have been aspiring to become. That kind of ballsy, epic, demon-slaying, head-crushing, attitude-laden metal that's full of the kind of brash, unfiltered machismo and leather jacket swagger that we really deserved, rather than feeling like a bunch of middle-aged men trying to stay down with the kids with edgy lyrics and juvenile songwriting. Octavision knows it's still progressive metal. It still has time for unusual instrumental breaks, for guitars that put the focus on flash over chug, and for structuring in its songwriting that goes against the conventional grain. But it has that accessible side too, with some of the coolest choruses, most foot-stomping riffs, and just an overall vibe of being the most badass music on the planet. This album is a perfect template of how to make this kind of music, to bridge the gap between traditional heavy metal and wibbly-wobbly progressive metal absolutely perfectly. Even if this project never happens again, Coexist is a brilliant album that will stand tall as the best example of this kind of metal that I can think of.
Look, it's a manager! A manager's coming to see us! Oh, he's so beefy! He is!
Yeah.
Okay, my last two entries might be a little contentious as to if these are prog, and maybe this one is also contentious as to if it's even a one and done. You see, Cooked on Phonics by Punky Bruster is the debut album from Devin Townsend, but I'm being generous and allowing one-off projects by established musicians here, and if I can let Arjen in with Guilt Machine, I can let Devi in with Punky Bruster. But it's not even really prog. I mean, yes, it's a concept album, and I firmly believe that without the tongue-in-cheek, overt comedy of Cooked on Phonics, then we wouldn't have Ziltoid the Omniscient. But this is, for all intents and purposes, a punk rock album, albeit one that's clearly having a great time lampooning the pop-punk phenomenon of the late 90s to early 2000s. The album follows the journey of death metal band Cryptic Coroner from south-central Poland, and how a minor mishap during a live performance saw them become a sell-out punk band, abandoning their roots to pursue fame and fortune. It is a record chock full of Townsend's signature humour, with plenty of crude, unfiltered jokes thrown in thick and fast, all against a backdrop of remarkably well-executed pop-punk that does an incredible job of emulating the movement of which this album was a clear, dirty protest against. The transition of Cryptic Coroner, consisting of the fictional bands of Lord Stenchlaw, Jokor, King of the Orcs, and Underwater, to Dr. Skinny, Squid Vicious, and Dances with Chickens, respectively, is hilarious as their increasingly higher-pitched chipmunk voices take over, and their abandonment of their death metal roots becomes fully formed. It's honestly hard not to crease up laughing at the absurdity of it all, but Townsend sadly seems to have largely forgotten or dismissed the album's existence, with Songs from this at live shows being virtually non-existent, which is a real shame given how much fun this record is. And last on our list is Wintergatan's self-titled debut. Now, this is very much not progressive rock or metal, but I would still be comfortable putting this one in the bracket of progressive electronica, and given how creative and adventurous this album was, I still feel that this has relevance to anybody watching this video. Now, most people who've heard of this band will have done so from their supremely ambitious Marble Machine project, which to date has a staggering 248 million views on YouTube. But this album came before that. However, it nonetheless carries all the sense of musicianship and quirky creativity that was evident in the amount of effort into the creation of that insane contraption. The band have forged their own instruments in places when they couldn't find the right ones for the sounds they were going for. They pushed hard in terms of their songwriting, and their boundless creativity and optimism is evident on every single song on this album. There's a sense of pure European whimsy to be found across the DNA of this record, but at its heart, this album is progressive. It is truly pushing the envelope, and frankly, there's very little else out there that sounds even remotely like these guys. The last track of Paradis is one of my all-time favourite progressive songs. Rock and metal be damned, this song defies classification other than just progressive, and deserves to be heard by anyone and everyone who calls themselves a fan of music. It is a stunning end to an album that has lived with me rent-free in my head for 12 years now, and I have been regularly revisiting this one and think I would happily call this one of my favourites of all time across all genres of music. So, there we have it, my picks for 10 of the best one-shot progressive albums out there. Now, I know I'm certain to have missed quite a few off this list, so I'd love to hear what your choices are in the comments down below. If you have watched this far, thank you all so very much for sticking with me, especially those of you who've been here since the very beginning. Your support honestly means the world to me, and you help to keep this curmudgeonly old git carrying on with this YouTube nonsense anyway. If you did like this video, please do drop it a thumbs up. Please do subscribe to the channel if you've been enjoying my content. And as always, guys, keep your rhyme signatures kind of odd.